Evelyn's footsteps echoed as she approached the entrance of her restaurant. It was a sound that, for her, had become as familiar as the back of her hand. The rhythmic tap of her heels on the polished stone floor was as regular as the beat of a heart, signaling the start of yet another day managing the business she had built from the ground up. Her life had been consumed by this place, the late nights spent poring over balance sheets, the early mornings where she greeted employees with a forced smile while wrestling with the exhaustion that had seeped into her bones. And yet, despite the hard work, the restaurant had begun to feel more like a burden than a passion. The customers still came, those loyal patrons who had been frequenting the restaurant for years, but there was a noticeable shift in the air. The energy was different, stagnant, lifeless even. Something was missing, and Evelyn couldn't put her finger on it. For the past few months, she had been dreading her visits here. The food didn't taste as fresh as it once did. The decor was dated, no longer in line with the modern trends she had once prided herself on keeping up with. And the staff, though friendly, lacked the enthusiasm they once had when they first started working here. Evelyn had thought long and hard about closing the restaurant, or maybe selling it off to someone else. But the thought of letting go of the dream she had worked so hard to create felt like defeat. The restaurant was her life, her identity. Without it, who was she? So, in desperation, she turned to a solution she would later regret. It started with a chance encounter, something so trivial at the time that Evelyn barely remembered it. One afternoon, as she was walking back from a meeting with her accountant, she saw him, Jake, a scruffy, unkempt man sitting outside a cafe with a cardboard sign that read, "Need work. Anything helps." He was dirty, his clothes torn and faded, and there was a look of resignation in his eyes. At first, she walked past him, as most people did, avoiding eye contact as if he were invisible. But something about him tugged at her, a sense of quiet despair that reminded her of the times in her own life when she had felt defeated and lost. Jake didn't speak as she passed, didn't plead for help or ask for change. Instead, he simply stared off into the distance, lost in thought, as if he was beyond caring about anything at all. Evelyn's initial instinct was to keep walking, to avoid the uncomfortable reality that some people, like Jake, were stuck in a life of uncertainty and struggle. But something in the air shifted. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was empathy. But Evelyn stopped and turned back. "I could use someone to help clean the restaurant," she said, not knowing what she was offering or why. Her voice felt foreign to her, detached, as if the words were being spoken by someone else. Jake looked up at her, his face unreadable. He seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if trying to process her offer, before he slowly nodded. "I can clean," he said simply, his voice rough and hoarse, as though he hadn't used it much in recent days. It wasn't the most conventional hire, but in a moment of frustration, Evelyn had taken a chance. She needed help, and at that point, she wasn't picky. Jake agreed to start the following day, and Evelyn handed him a key to the restaurant. She had no intention of offering him more than a menial job as a janitor, cleaning the floors, taking out the trash, and handling odd jobs around the place. She wasn't sure why she had decided to hire him, it was as if she needed something to change, anything. Perhaps, deep down, she also saw a reflection of herself in Jake, someone who had fallen through the cracks, just like her business. The next few days passed quietly, and Evelyn didn't pay much attention to Jake's work. He was there early in the mornings, cleaning the tables, sweeping the floors, and making the place look presentable enough for the opening hours. He didn't talk much. In fact, he rarely spoke at all. His presence was mostly a shadow, a background fixture that she could ignore as she ran the business. But there was something about Jake that Evelyn couldn't shake. She started noticing small things that caught her off guard, things that seemed out of place, yet somehow right. One morning, when she arrived to check on the kitchen, she found that the staff had rearranged the dining room. The old wooden chairs had been replaced with sleek, modern designs. The faded red velvet curtains were gone, replaced with lighter, more inviting fabrics. The place, though subtle, felt fresher, more alive. When she asked the staff about it, they shrugged. Jake said it would give the place a new vibe, they explained. He's been working on it for a few days. At first, Evelyn was furious. Who did this man think he was, making changes without her approval? The decor was an integral part of her restaurant's identity, and she had carefully selected every detail. But as the day went on, she began to realize that the changes, while unconventional, did make the place feel better, more open, more inviting, more modern. Customers even mentioned that they liked the new layout, that it felt fresher and more comfortable. The transformation was subtle, but it was there. Evelyn dismissed it as coincidence. Maybe Jake had a few decent ideas. But that was all. After all, he was still just a janitor, right? However, the more she observed, the more she realized that Jake was doing more than just cleaning. He was taking pride in the restaurant, in ways Evelyn hadn't seen in years. He'd started chatting with the staff, helping them with their tasks, suggesting new recipes, and even helping them source local ingredients. He started giving the staff pep talks, reminding them to greet customers with warmth, to treat the restaurant like it was their own. It was almost as if he'd taken ownership of the place without her permission. One evening, as Evelyn was passing by the kitchen, she overheard Jake talking to the head chef. "The menu feels stale," he said. "The food's fine, but it's not exciting anymore. People want something new, something different." He continued, suggesting adding a few innovative dishes, ones that tied into local trends. "How about a fresh take on the local seafood? Something that's never been done here before," he proposed. The chef, a gruff man who had worked for Evelyn for years, responded with skepticism but agreed to give it a shot. Evelyn was furious when she heard this. Jake had crossed a line. A janitor had no right to suggest menu changes, let alone have such a significant impact on the restaurant's direction. Yet, despite herself, she found herself intrigued. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was something to his ideas. But the real test came when Evelyn decided to take a short vacation. It wasn't a long trip, just a few days away to clear her head. She needed a break, away from the pressure of running a business that was starting to feel more like an anchor than a lifeline. She left the restaurant in Jake's hands, knowing that it would be just a few days, and nothing would change. When Evelyn returned, she wasn't prepared for what she found. The moment she stepped through the door, she was hit with an overwhelming sense of unfamiliarity. The smell of fresh herbs and new spices filled the air. The lighting was softer, warmer, intimate even. The floors, once worn and scratched, now gleamed in the dim light. The place felt different, alive. The staff was in high spirits, greeting her with unexpected enthusiasm. Even the customers, who had always been reserved, seemed more engaged, smiling as they ate and chatted. But it wasn't until she entered the dining area that the full extent of the change hit her. The entire space had been transformed. Gone were the old-fashioned tables and chairs she had painstakingly selected. Instead, there were sleek, modern pieces that gave the room a contemporary feel. The walls, once adorned with heavy, ornate paintings, now boasted minimalist art that made the space feel fresh and innovative. Evelyn stood frozen in the doorway, her heart pounding. This wasn't just a new coat of paint. This was a complete overhaul. The restaurant she had known for years was unrecognizable. She turned to the staff, her voice shaky. "What happened here?" she asked, trying to mask her shock. One of the waiters, a young man who had worked for her for years, smiled. "Jake did it," he said. "He said we needed to make the place feel new again. And, well, he was right." Evelyn's mind raced. Jake? But he's just a janitor. He didn't have permission to do any of this. She was furious, her blood boiling as she tried to make sense of the chaos. As she walked toward the kitchen, her mind filled with confusion and anger, she was met by Jake. He stood in the doorway, his face calm and unreadable. "I took the liberty of making some changes," he said, his voice as calm as ever. "You seem to need it." Evelyn stared at him, her thoughts swirling. What had she done? What had he done? How had everything changed so quickly, and was it for the better? She didn't know yet, but she was about to find out. Evelyn had always prided herself on being in control. As a woman who built a successful restaurant from scratch, she had learned to juggle the complexities of running a business while managing the delicate balance between tradition and innovation. Her restaurant was a symbol of her dedication, her blood, sweat, and tears. It wasn't just a place where people came to eat, it was a reflection of her ambition, her identity. Every inch of the establishment had been carefully curated, from the chandeliers hanging above the tables to the intricate designs of the menu. But as she stood in the transformed space, with its modern fixtures and minimalist designs, Evelyn felt something unsettling stir inside her, a sense of loss, but also a curiosity she couldn't ignore. She turned away from Jake, who stood motionless by the door, his hands shoved into his pockets, as though he knew he had crossed a line but wasn't quite ready to face the consequences. The rest of the staff milled about, waiting for her to say something, to tell them how to proceed. They looked at her with uncertain eyes, as though they were expecting a reprimand, but there was something else, something deeper, that Evelyn couldn't pinpoint. For the first time in years, her restaurant felt alive, almost as if it had a new soul, and that soul wasn't hers. But where had it all gone wrong? Where had things slipped out of her control? She retreated to her office, needing space to breathe and think. The air in the restaurant, despite the changes, still smelled faintly of old grease and stale air. She was used to the scent, the smell of her hard work, of long hours spent serving plates and managing customers. But now, it felt out of place, clashing with the new energy that seemed to seep from every corner of the room. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm the chaos in her mind. Evelyn had always been a woman of routine, of predictability. Wake up, run the restaurant, deal with the staff, interact with the customers, check the books. It was a cycle that had been her life for so long that she had started to believe it would never change. But now, staring at the walls that had once been familiar and comforting, she realized she had become a prisoner of that routine. The world outside the restaurant had changed, and she hadn't noticed. The food industry was evolving, as it always did, but the restaurant remained static, stubborn in its refusal to adapt. As Evelyn thought back to her early days in the business, she remembered how she had once thrived on change. The excitement of taking risks, of pushing boundaries, was what had drawn her into this world. She had been fearless once, confident in her decisions, eager to explore new flavors, new ideas, and new experiences. But over time, she had become more cautious, more conservative. The success of her restaurant had created a bubble around her, a bubble that insulated her from the outside world and from the very changes she had once embraced. And then there was Jake. How had a man like him, a vagrant with no formal training or education, managed to understand what Evelyn had been too blind to see? He had walked into her restaurant with nothing, and yet, in a matter of days, he had done more to breathe new life into it than Evelyn had in the past year. It was baffling, humbling, and, if she was being honest with herself, terrifying. Who was he? What had he seen that she couldn't? And why had she, someone who had spent years building this place, never considered these ideas before? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door, and without waiting for a response, Jake walked in. He stood there, as usual, with that calm, measured look on his face, as if he had no idea that he was standing in front of a woman whose entire world was unraveling. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice steady, as though the fact that he had changed the entire essence of her restaurant was of no consequence to him. Evelyn struggled to find her words. "I don't know what to say," she finally managed, sitting down behind her desk and running a hand through her hair. "You've changed everything. You've gone too far. I never asked for this. I don't even recognize my own restaurant anymore." Jake didn't flinch. "I know," he said. "And I understand how you feel. But sometimes, things have to get uncomfortable before they can get better. You've been running this place for a long time, and I can see the wear on you. The same walls, the same menu, the same routines day after day. It was suffocating you, and it was suffocating this restaurant. You needed a change, whether you realized it or not." Evelyn stared at him, her anger simmering beneath the surface. "And you thought it was your place to make that change? You thought I wouldn't notice?" Jake's gaze softened. "I didn't think you wouldn't notice. I just didn't think you'd ever allow yourself to see it. People like you, people who build things from the ground up, they sometimes forget to step back and look at the bigger picture. They get so lost in the work, in the daily grind, that they forget why they started in the first place." There was something almost prophetic in his words, and Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She wanted to argue, to tear him down and put him in his place. She had built this restaurant with her own hands. How dare he come in and act like he knew more about it than she did? But the truth was, she didn't know. She didn't know what had happened to the passion she once had, the spark that had driven her every day. She had allowed the restaurant to become a machine, a routine. It was no longer about creativity or joy. It was about keeping up appearances and surviving. And maybe Jake had seen that. Maybe he had sensed her complacency in ways she hadn't been able to admit to herself. "I didn't ask for this," she repeated, her voice a little softer this time. "But, it's working, isn't it? People are noticing the changes. Customers are coming back. The staff is more engaged. Even the atmosphere feels different." Jake nodded. "It's because it's not just about the surface. The change has to come from within. I've been here long enough to know that. This place needed more than a coat of paint, it needed a new purpose. A new direction." Evelyn felt a knot form in her stomach. The changes were undeniable. The restaurant was thriving in a way it hadn't in years. She had always been proud of the food, the service, the ambience, but now there was something else, a new energy that filled the air. The old regulars were coming in, but they weren't just coming for the food. They were coming for the experience, for the fresh vibe, for the feeling of something new and exciting. She stared at Jake, still trying to process everything. "You've done more in a few days than I could have in a year. But why? Why did you do this?" Jake leaned against the doorframe, his eyes distant, almost lost in thought. "Because I've been where you are. I've seen what happens when people let fear keep them from growing. When they get stuck in their routines and forget that change is the only constant in life. I've had nothing, literally nothing, but I've always known how to adapt, how to survive. And sometimes, survival means making difficult decisions. It means seeing what no one else is willing to see." Evelyn felt a strange sense of admiration for him, despite herself. He had no formal training. No education. No connections. But somehow, he had done what she had been too afraid to do. He had saved her restaurant. He had reminded her that growth comes not just from success, but from failure, from risk, from change. And now, the restaurant was alive again, perhaps more alive than it had ever been before. The next few weeks flew by in a whirlwind of excitement and uncertainty. Evelyn watched as the restaurant continued to flourish. The new decor, the updated menu, and the enthusiastic energy from the staff created a buzz around town that hadn't existed in years. The customers who once came in out of habit were now coming back because they wanted to be a part of something special. But Evelyn knew that things were far from perfect. The changes Jake had made were bold, and they had come at a cost. The staff was adjusting to the new environment, and there were tensions beneath the surface. Some were unsure about the shift in the restaurant's direction, while others were excited about the future. But for Evelyn, the real challenge lay in confronting the truth she had long avoided: she couldn't do it all on her own. She had been so focused on maintaining control that she had lost sight of the very thing that had drawn her to the restaurant business in the first place: the joy of creation, of innovation, of taking risks. And now, as the dust settled and the restaurant found its new rhythm, Evelyn was faced with a difficult decision. What was she willing to sacrifice for the future? Would she continue to fight for control, or would she let go and allow Jake to continue the work he had started? The question lingered in her mind, one she knew she would have to answer sooner or later. But for now, she watched as the restaurant thrived because of the very change she had been too afraid to embrace. And as she did, she realized that sometimes, it takes a complete stranger, a vagrant, no less, to remind you that the most powerful transformations often come from the most unexpected places. And in that moment, Evelyn knew her life, her business, and her perspective had been forever altered. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity and subtle shifts in the air. Evelyn watched her restaurant evolve, each day bringing with it an unpredictable mix of emotions. There was excitement, yes, but beneath that excitement was a constant undercurrent of tension. The restaurant was thriving, there was no doubt about it: new customers, returning regulars, and an atmosphere that felt electric, but Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that something still wasn't quite right. Jake had given her a gift, but the consequences of accepting it loomed over her like a storm cloud. She had spent so much time trying to control everything that she hadn't realized the most important thing she could do was let go. Jake had made bold decisions, some of which she would have never considered, and it had worked. But letting someone else take the reins of her restaurant, even for the betterment of the business, felt like a betrayal of the blood, sweat, and tears she had poured into this place. It wasn't just a restaurant, it was her legacy, her creation. To think that someone, especially someone like Jake, could transform it so thoroughly in such a short period was something she couldn't fully reconcile. The more she observed Jake, the more she felt a strange sense of admiration mixed with jealousy. He had this uncanny ability to see things in a way no one else did. His ideas were unconventional, his methods even more so, but there was something undeniably refreshing about the way he approached everything. He didn't care about tradition. He didn't care about following the rules. He cared only about one thing: change. And he was determined to make it happen, regardless of the consequences. Evelyn had always believed that success was about balance, about keeping the old while embracing the new. She had tried to strike that balance in her restaurant, mixing classic dishes with modern touches. But Jake? He didn't bother with balance. He tore it all down, stripped away the comfortable layers, and rebuilt it in his own image. And the result was nothing short of revolutionary. Every morning, Evelyn would arrive at the restaurant, her mind still swirling with questions. What was Jake's next move? What changes would he make? Would it be enough? Would it be too much? She knew that things couldn't stay like this forever. Eventually, they would have to confront the tension between them, the tension between her desire for control and his drive for radical change. One of them would have to give. But that day wasn't today. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the newly redesigned dining room, Evelyn walked in to find Jake sitting at a table, his hands folded in front of him, his expression thoughtful. There was a quiet confidence about him that made him seem almost out of place in the chaos of the bustling restaurant. "Jake," Evelyn said, approaching the table with caution. "We need to talk." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her stomach flutter. "About what?" "About the restaurant," she said, taking a seat across from him. "About everything." Jake's lips curved into a slight smile. "I thought we'd already talked about everything." Evelyn hesitated. There was a tension in the air that made her feel exposed, like she was standing on the edge of something dangerous. "No. Not really. You've done so much, but I need to know, what comes next? Where does this go from here?" Jake leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming rhythmically against the wood. "It goes wherever you want it to go," he said, his voice steady. "But you have to be willing to let go. To stop trying to hold on to what used to be." Evelyn felt a knot form in her chest. She had heard those words before, but hearing them from him made them feel heavier, more real. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. Jake's eyes softened, and for the first time, he seemed almost vulnerable. "I know it's hard. But you can't keep holding on to the past. You have to allow the restaurant to grow, to evolve. It's not about what it was anymore. It's about what it can be. What we can make it." The words stung, but they were also freeing in a way Evelyn hadn't expected. She had spent so much time clinging to what her restaurant used to be that she hadn't allowed herself to imagine what it could become. The fear of losing control had kept her from seeing the bigger picture. Now, for the first time in a long while, she was beginning to understand. Jake had been right all along. The restaurant wasn't just a business, it was a living, breathing entity. It needed to change, to grow, to adapt. And if that meant letting go of the past, then maybe that was the price she had to pay. But there was another part of Evelyn that still resisted. Could she really let go? Could she truly allow Jake, this stranger, this vagrant, to continue his work, to push the restaurant further down a path she hadn't planned for? The idea of losing control was terrifying, but the idea of clinging to an outdated version of her dream was even more so. Over the next few days, Evelyn found herself at a crossroads. She watched Jake move through the restaurant, giving orders, rearranging the kitchen, and making decisions that seemed to come with ease. It was clear that he was comfortable in this new role, that he was more than capable of running the show. But every time she watched him, something inside her churned. She had worked so hard to get here, to build this place from the ground up. How could she just hand it over to him? But as the days passed, Evelyn began to notice something she hadn't before. The restaurant was thriving, not just financially, but emotionally. The staff was happier, more engaged. The customers were excited, eager to experience what the place had become. The change had sparked something in them, something that Evelyn couldn't deny was working. The question wasn't whether Jake was the right person for the job. It was whether she was willing to step back and let him lead. One afternoon, after a particularly busy lunch rush, Evelyn found herself standing in the restaurant, watching the staff interact with the customers, laughing and working together like a well-oiled machine. There was a sense of camaraderie that hadn't existed before, a sense of community that made her heart swell with pride. This wasn't just her restaurant anymore. It was theirs. And for the first time in a long time, Evelyn realized that maybe that was okay. She walked over to Jake, who was overseeing the bar, making small talk with the patrons as he worked. There was a calmness about him, a confidence that made him stand out in a way she couldn't quite place. "You were right," Evelyn said, her voice soft but firm. "About everything." Jake raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching into a smile. "About what?" "The changes. The restaurant. I see now that you were right all along. I've been so focused on keeping things the same, on holding on to what used to work, that I forgot to let things evolve." Jake nodded, his expression unreadable. "You were never meant to do it alone, Evelyn. You can't hold everything in your hands and expect it to grow. Sometimes, you have to let other people in." Evelyn felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She had been so afraid of losing control, of giving up the reins, but in that moment, she realized that true leadership wasn't about control, it was about trust. Trusting herself, trusting Jake, and trusting the people who had worked beside her all these years. And so, Evelyn made a choice that would change everything. She would let Jake continue the work he had started, but she wouldn't disappear. She would be there, every step of the way, guiding the restaurant into its new future, but with a different mindset, one that was open to change, to growth, and to collaboration. The restaurant had a new direction, a new purpose. And for the first time in years, Evelyn felt like she was truly alive again. The days following Evelyn's decision felt different. There was a shift in the air, a new sense of clarity, almost as though the fog that had clouded her mind for months had finally lifted. The restaurant hummed with energy, a vitality that Evelyn had almost forgotten was possible. Jake continued to work his magic, creating a culture of innovation that rippled through the staff. He had no formal training, no qualifications that anyone could point to, but he had an intuitive grasp of what people needed, what they craved. And it wasn't just food, it was an experience, a feeling, a connection. Evelyn had started to understand something fundamental. It wasn't enough for a restaurant to simply serve great food anymore. The world had changed. People weren't just coming for the taste, they were coming for the atmosphere, for the story behind the meal, for the experience of being part of something that felt alive, authentic, and new. Jake had tapped into that, and it was exactly what the restaurant had needed. But as the weeks passed, Evelyn began to notice something else. The changes, while invigorating and positive on the surface, had brought their own set of challenges. With more customers coming through the door, the pressure on the kitchen staff had increased. Long shifts, tight deadlines, and the constant need to stay ahead of demand were starting to take their toll. Some of the older staff members, who had been with her since the early days, were beginning to show signs of fatigue. They had been used to the old ways, the quieter, more predictable rhythms of the restaurant, but now, everything was faster, more fluid. At the same time, the excitement that had initially surrounded Jake's ideas was beginning to sour for a few people. The newer staff, those who had joined after the transformation, were adapting seamlessly, their energy feeding off the whirlwind of changes. But for the veterans, it was a different story. Some found the constant innovation tiring. Others felt like they had lost their place in the new structure. Evelyn noticed the subtle signs of discontent, a whispered comment here, a sullen glance there, but she couldn't ignore the weight of the situation. She couldn't afford to lose her most experienced team members, especially after all they had been through together. One afternoon, after a particularly busy lunch rush, Evelyn found herself sitting in the back office, staring at a mountain of paperwork that had been piling up for days. The sound of laughter and chatter drifted through the walls, a reminder that the restaurant was thriving. And yet, in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were teetering on the edge of something she wasn't quite sure how to control. Jake walked in, his usual calm presence immediately filling the room. He seemed unaffected by the chaos outside, his demeanor always cool, almost distant. But as he closed the door behind him and sat down across from her, Evelyn could see the weight of the situation in his eyes. "You've been quiet," he said, his tone casual but with an undercurrent of concern. "What's going on?" Evelyn sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I don't know, Jake. I feel like we're on the brink of something great, but at the same time, I'm worried we're pushing too hard. The staff is, not all of them are keeping up. I'm starting to see cracks." Jake leaned forward, his brow furrowing. "Cracks?" Evelyn nodded, her eyes distant as she thought about the team. Some of the older staff members, they're struggling with the changes. It's not just the workload, it's the pace. We're moving faster than some of them are comfortable with. I've noticed it more and more these past few days. They're tired, and they're starting to question whether they even fit into this new version of the restaurant. Jake was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the floor as he processed her words. Finally, he spoke, his voice measured. "I can understand that. Change is never easy, especially for people who've been in the same routine for years. But they have to understand that this isn't just a phase. This is the future of the restaurant. The world's changing, and we have to change with it." Evelyn nodded, but the doubt still lingered. "I know. But I don't want to lose them. These people have been with me from the beginning. They helped build this place. They deserve better than to feel like they're being left behind." Jake met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. You can't keep everyone happy, Evelyn. No matter how much you want to. Some people will rise with the changes, and some won't. It's the nature of progress. But the ones who stick with us will help carry the restaurant into the future. You have to trust that. It was a harsh truth, but it was one Evelyn knew deep down. She had been avoiding it for weeks, clinging to the hope that everything could stay in balance, that she could accommodate everyone's needs. But Jake was right. The world didn't work that way. Change was inevitable, and it came at a cost. In the days that followed, Evelyn decided to have one-on-one conversations with her longtime staff members. It wasn't easy. She knew that some of them were resistant to the changes, but she had to know where they stood. She couldn't afford to pretend everything was fine if it wasn't. The first conversation was with Lena, the head chef. Lena had been with Evelyn from the very beginning, back when the restaurant was just an idea, a dream. She had poured her heart and soul into the kitchen, and it was clear that the transformation of the restaurant was weighing on her. I know it's been a lot, Lena, Evelyn said softly as they sat down in the small break room. I've seen how hard you've been working. I appreciate everything you've done. But I need to know, how are you really feeling? Lena looked tired, her face drawn and pale. She didn't speak for a moment, staring down at her hands, clearly wrestling with her thoughts. Finally, she looked up at Evelyn, her eyes filled with both frustration and resignation. I feel like I'm drowning, she admitted. It's not the food, Evelyn. I've always loved the food. But the pace, it's too much. We're pushing so fast, and I can't keep up. It's like we're trying to be everything to everyone, and I don't know how much longer I can keep doing it. Evelyn's heart sank. She had suspected that Lena felt this way, but hearing it out loud made it real. This was her friend, her colleague, the person who had helped her create something beautiful. Losing her wasn't an option, but Evelyn also knew she couldn't keep things the way they were. I hear you, Lena, Evelyn said, her voice steady. And I'm not going to ask you to keep going if it's breaking you. I'll do whatever it takes to find a balance. I don't want you to feel like you're being left behind. I need you to be part of this. I need your help to figure out how we move forward. Lena's eyes softened, and for the first time in days, she smiled faintly. I just don't want to be left in the dust. I've spent years building this place with you. I don't want to be forgotten in all this change. You won't be, Evelyn promised. I'll make sure of it. Evelyn spent the next few days listening to the concerns of the other staff members, trying to find a way to balance their needs with the new direction the restaurant was heading. She couldn't deny that the restaurant was thriving, but she also realized that it couldn't come at the expense of her team's well-being. There had to be a way to keep the energy alive without burning everyone out. In the end, Evelyn decided to implement a new approach, one that would allow for the innovation that Jake had brought, but with a pace that was sustainable for everyone. She would hire more staff to help with the increased demand, and she would create a more structured work environment to help ease the pressure on the veterans. Most importantly, she would make sure that everyone felt like they were part of the journey, not left behind. The changes were gradual, but they worked. The team began to find its rhythm again, with new members integrating into the fold and the veterans adapting to the faster pace without feeling overwhelmed. And as Evelyn stood back and watched it all unfold, she realized that perhaps the greatest gift of all wasn't just the success of the restaurant, it was the lesson she had learned, that true growth comes not from trying to control everything, but from trusting the people around you, even when the road ahead seems uncertain. It wasn't about letting go of the past, it was about moving forward, together. Evelyn had learned to trust. She had learned to let go of the reins, to let the restaurant breathe and evolve, and to accept that she could no longer shoulder the weight of every decision on her own. But as much as she had embraced this new way of thinking, the restaurant's rapid success brought with it an undeniable tension, one that was both exhilarating and overwhelming. It seemed that every day was filled with unexpected challenges and new victories. The old rhythms that had once defined the place had been replaced with a kind of chaotic energy that was at once thrilling and frightening. There were times when Evelyn would sit in her office late at night, staring at the glowing reports, unsure of how things had gotten to this point. But the weight of her choices, the path she had chosen to follow, had become inescapable. It was a Friday afternoon, and the restaurant was bustling. The energy in the air was electric, a combination of excitement and anticipation as the weekend rush began. Evelyn sat at the bar, trying to take in the scene, her mind moving 1,000 miles a minute. Jake had his hands full, but he was managing it with his usual cool composure, directing the staff, running the show, and keeping everything in motion. It was clear to Evelyn that the restaurant was no longer just hers. It had become a reflection of everything Jake had brought to it, a testament to his unconventional methods and bold vision. She couldn't deny the success that had come from it, but a strange sense of unease was creeping in again. Lena, the head chef, had seemed to find her footing again, and the veteran staff members, who had once been resistant to the changes, were now finding their place in this new dynamic. But as much as things were falling into place, Evelyn couldn't ignore the way things had shifted between herself and Jake. The trust that had developed between them during their partnership had created an almost unspoken bond. They worked seamlessly together, anticipating each other's moves, almost as herself or for something else. Had she created it to prove a point, to make her mark in the world, or had she done it because she truly believed in what it could be? There were moments when she questioned her own motives, when she wondered if she had lost sight of the passion that had driven her from the beginning. She had wanted to make a difference, to create something meaningful. But in the process, had she sacrificed her own happiness for the sake of success? The question lingered in the back of her mind, gnawing at her. Could she find a balance between the woman who had built this restaurant and the one who now had to let go of control? As the night wore on, Evelyn found herself pulled back into the rhythms of the restaurant. The kitchen was humming with activity, the servers moving with practiced efficiency, and the customers were enjoying their meals with evident satisfaction. The energy in the restaurant was intoxicating, and for a brief moment, Evelyn was swept up in it, feeling the rush of adrenaline that came with success. But as she looked around, she still couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was the sense of belonging she had once felt, or perhaps it was the nagging feeling that the changes, while good, had created an emotional distance she wasn't sure how to bridge. Jake had given her space to find her place in the new dynamic, but Evelyn realized that she had to take the next step. She couldn't keep running from her own doubts. If she truly wanted to be part of the restaurant again, she had to take ownership of it in a way that didn't feel like surrendering control but like embracing a new role. She wasn't just the owner anymore, she was a part of a larger vision. And that vision didn't have to exclude her. It could include her in a different way, one that allowed her to still contribute her passion and ideas without stifling the progress Jake had brought. The following morning, Evelyn arrived at the restaurant early. The staff had yet to arrive, and the place was quiet, almost peaceful. She walked through the dining room, her fingers brushing the edges of the furniture, as if reconnecting with the space in a way she hadn't in months. She stopped at the kitchen door, watching Lena as she prepared for the day ahead. It was clear that the stress was still there, but there was a steadiness in Lena's movements that hadn't been present before. The team was adjusting, adapting, finding their place in the new world of the restaurant. Evelyn felt a surge of gratitude for these people, the ones who had stood by her through the ups and downs. It wasn't just about the restaurant anymore, it was about the relationships, the shared experiences, and the trust they had built together. She was ready to step back in, but this time, she would do it on her own terms. Jake found her standing at the kitchen door, watching Lena work. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside her, taking in the scene. Then, after a moment of silence, he spoke. "I think you've found your place again," he said, his voice low but warm. Evelyn nodded slowly. "I think I have." And for the first time in months, Evelyn felt a sense of peace. She had let go. She had trusted. But now, she was ready to take control again, not to micromanage, but to lead in a way that was authentic to her. It wasn't about clinging to the past. It was about moving forward together, with purpose and clarity. The restaurant had become something new, something bigger than both of them. But it had also become a place where she could finally find herself again. And that, more than anything, was what mattered most. As the weeks passed, Evelyn found herself easing into the new rhythm of the restaurant. It wasn't as fast-paced as before, nor was it entirely without pressure. There were still challenges, staff to manage, orders to fulfill, customer expectations to meet. But there was something different now. The changes that had once felt so daunting had begun to settle into place. The restaurant was no longer just a business to Evelyn, it had become an extension of herself. She could feel it in the way she walked through the dining room, in the way the kitchen buzzed with energy. It was hers in a way that no spreadsheet, no meeting with investors, no marketing strategy could ever define. It was personal, and it was real. Evelyn had come to realize that the balance she had been searching for was never about controlling every detail. It was about letting go, trusting those around her, and stepping into her role as a leader in a way that felt right for her. She wasn't the sole visionary anymore, and that was something she had struggled with for a long time. But Jake had taught her that leadership didn't always mean being the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes, it meant knowing when to step back and allow others to lead, when to trust that the people you surrounded yourself with had the capacity to carry the vision forward. Her relationship with Jake had shifted, too. At first, there had been an undercurrent of tension between them. She had been afraid that his success and vision for the restaurant would eclipse her own, but as they continued to work side by side, Evelyn came to understand that they weren't in competition. They were a team. Jake brought a fresh energy, an outsider's perspective that had breathed new life into the place, and Evelyn's years of experience and dedication grounded everything. They complemented each other in ways that she hadn't fully appreciated until recently. What had once been an uneasy partnership had blossomed into something deeper, more balanced. It wasn't perfect, there were moments when they clashed, when their ideas didn't align, but they had learned how to navigate those differences. It wasn't about agreement all the time, it was about respect, and that respect had become the cornerstone of their partnership. Jake was no longer just an employee or a hired consultant, he had become a trusted colleague, someone who could see beyond the numbers and into the heart of the restaurant. He had become part of the family, and that meant something to Evelyn. They had built something together, something that was more than the sum of its parts. It was a place where creativity thrived, where the staff felt heard and valued, and where the food wasn't just a product, it was an experience, an expression of the values they held as a team. But even as the restaurant seemed to find its rhythm, Evelyn couldn't escape the nagging feeling that there was still something missing. She had been so focused on the mechanics of the business, on the logistics, on the operations, that she had neglected something important, her connection to the community. The restaurant had grown, but it hadn't always grown in ways that felt personal. Sure, they had loyal customers, regulars who came back week after week. But Evelyn missed the days when the restaurant had been more than just a place to eat. It had been a gathering spot, a place where people could come together, share stories, and feel like they were part of something bigger. She missed that sense of intimacy, of connection. The restaurant had become so successful, so popular, that it sometimes felt more like a machine than a living, breathing entity. One evening, as she was walking through the dining room, Evelyn spotted an old couple sitting at one of the tables by the window. They were regulars, and though she didn't know them personally, she recognized them from their frequent visits. They were having dinner, their heads close together, speaking in hushed tones. Evelyn watched them for a moment, taking in the quiet intimacy between them. It was a reminder, one she had been needing, that food wasn't just about nourishment. It was about connection. It was about creating a space where people could feel seen, heard, and valued. The thought stuck with her as she went about her work that evening, but it wasn't until the following week that Evelyn took action. She called Jake into her office and laid out her idea, a special event, something that would bring the community together. It wasn't about fancy food or high-end wines, it was about sharing stories, experiences, and memories. She wanted to create an evening where the focus wasn't on the restaurant's success or the bottom line, but on the people who made it all possible, both the staff and the customers. Jake listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "You want to do something more personal," he said when she finished explaining her vision. "Something that connects the restaurant back to its roots." Evelyn nodded, relieved that Jake understood. "Yes. I think we've lost sight of that, in a way. We've been so focused on the business side of things that I've forgotten what made this place special in the first place. It wasn't just the food. It was the relationships we built with people. I want to bring that back." Jake smiled, the light in his eyes reflecting the same spark of creativity that had first drawn her to him. "I think it's a great idea. It's about time we gave the community something in return. Let's make it happen." They decided to host a dinner with the community event, one that would allow customers to share their stories and experiences while enjoying a meal together. They would invite local vendors to provide ingredients, and the staff would come up with a menu based on seasonal ingredients. But the real focus would be on the people. The goal was to create an evening where everyone felt like they were part of something, a celebration of the local community, a thank you to those who had supported the restaurant through its many phases. The planning process was a whirlwind. Evelyn poured herself into it, working closely with the team to make sure every detail was perfect. They reached out to local businesses, created a menu that reflected the diverse tastes of their customers, and started promoting the event on social media. The response was overwhelming. Tickets sold out within days, and the excitement around the event was palpable. People were eager to come together, to reconnect in a way that felt more personal than just eating out at a restaurant. The night of the event, the restaurant was buzzing with energy. The tables were filled with familiar faces, regulars, newcomers, and even some people who had never been to the restaurant before. There was a warmth in the air, a sense of togetherness that Evelyn hadn't felt in a long time. The staff was excited, but there was no frantic rush this time. Everyone was working together, enjoying the process, knowing that the focus wasn't just on efficiency, but on creating an experience. As the evening unfolded, Evelyn watched in awe. People were talking, laughing, sharing stories about their lives, their experiences, and their memories. The atmosphere was one of celebration, but not in the way she had expected. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the people. The connections being made, the relationships being strengthened, the sense of community that was growing in front of her. She realized that, in focusing so much on the business side, she had forgotten what made this restaurant special. It was never just about the food, or the revenue, or the awards. It was about bringing people together. By the end of the night, as the last guests trickled out, Evelyn stood in the empty dining room, looking around at the tables that had been filled with laughter and conversation just hours before. It was quiet now, but the energy still lingered. The event had been a resounding success, but more importantly, it had reminded her of what she had been missing. It wasn't just about building a restaurant, it was about building relationships, fostering a sense of belonging, and creating a space where people could connect. Jake joined her in the dining room, his face lighting up as he saw the satisfaction in her eyes. "That was incredible," he said. "I think we've just started something big here." Evelyn smiled, the weight she had been carrying lifting just a little bit. "I think you're right. This place isn't just mine anymore. It's ours. And it's about time we made it feel like home again." And in that moment, Evelyn knew she had found her balance. She was still part of the restaurant, still its heart and soul, but now, she was leading it in a way that felt true to who she was, to what she believed in. The journey wasn't over, but the next chapter had begun. And this time, it was clear that it was a journey she would be taking alongside her team, her community, and the people who had supported her from the very beginning. She didn't have to carry the weight alone anymore.